For 6 months after my wife passed, there was a sealed envelope sitting in her attorney's office with my name on the front of it, and I let it sit there. My wife had made arrangements with her own estate attorney, a woman named Lorna Holt, who practiced out of a 2-story brick building on Fairfield Avenue in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, to hold a personal letter until I came to claim it. I had known about the envelope since the week after the funeral, when Lorna called to offer her condolences and mentioned, gently, that my wife had asked her to hold something for me. I told her I'd be in soon. That was February. By the time my own attorney, Jerome, finally stopped being gentle about it, it was August. Jerome had been patient, the way people are patient when they've lost someone, and understand that grief doesn't operate on a schedule. But one Tuesday morning he called and told me plainly that the estate wouldn't close until I went and collected that envelope. Lorna had been waiting 6 months and had other pending matters she needed to wrap up. So I drove the 14 miles into Elizabethtown on a Wednesday, parked on Fairfield, and sat in my truck for about 10 minutes before I went inside. Lorna Holt was in her mid-40s, steady and quiet, in the way that good attorneys learn to be. She had a small office with tall windows and a shelf of plants behind her desk that my wife would have admired. When I came through the door, she didn't greet me the way you'd greet a man you hadn't seen in a while. She greeted me the way you'd greet a man you'd been quietly worried about for months. She asked if I'd like some water. I said no. She asked if I'd sit down. I did. Then she said, before she gave me the envelope, there was something she needed to tell me first. 12 days ago, a man had come into her office, presenting himself as a representative acting on behalf of the estate. He'd had a document claiming I had authorized him to collect the sealed letter. Lorna had asked him to wait while she called Jerome to verify. She hadn't reached him. By the time she returned from her phone, the man was gone. She'd asked her receptionist to describe him. She'd also pulled the parking lot camera footage from the building across the street. She turned her laptop around so I could see the still image. I'd known that walk for 22 years, the forward lean of the shoulders, the way his right hand stayed in his jacket pocket even when it wasn't cold. I'd watched that man cross parking lots and job sites and the floor of my own truck yard from the day we shook hands and agreed to go into business together. My business partner had tried to get my wife's sealed letter before I did. I sat in Lorna's office for a while after she showed me the footage. She got me the water I'd refused earlier, and I drank it without tasting it. My partner and I had built Bluegrass Cold Haul together over 22 years, starting with 3 refrigerated trucks and a lease on a small lot outside of town. By the time I retired from the day-to-day operations 3 years ago, we were running 41 units across 4 states. He was younger than me by 11 years. He had the energy for the sales side. I'd had the logistics and the regulatory knowledge. For 2 decades, I would have said his name in the same sentence as the word trustworthy without thinking twice. Now I was sitting in an attorney's office, looking at a still image of him, trying to steal a letter my dead wife had left for me. Lorna gave me as much time as I needed. Then she brought the envelope. It was a standard white business envelope, sealed with tape in addition to the adhesive flap. My wife's handwriting on the front. Not a nickname, not the version of my name she used on ordinary days. She'd written my full name, the one on my driver's license, the one she used when she wanted me to understand that whatever she was saying required my complete attention. I asked Lorna for a private space. She showed me to a small conference room and closed the door. My wife had written on 6 pages, front and back, in the careful, even cursive she'd learned in parochial school in Western Virginia, and kept her entire life. The date at the top was 4 months before her cardiac event. She was 63. She'd had a mitral valve repaired 7 years prior, and her cardiologist had told her she was doing well. None of us had any reason to think that Mart morning would be different from any other. It wasn't until it was. She started the letter the way she started most difficult conversations, by saying that she loved me and that she was sorry she'd waited this long to say what she was about to say. She wrote that she'd been waiting because she wanted to be certain, and that by the time she was certain, she was also scared. Not of what my partner might do to her, she said, but of what I might do to myself if I found out the wrong way. Then she told me what she'd found. My wife had worked the administrative side of our company for the first 11 years we were in business. She'd managed billing, coordinated with the insurance carrier, kept the vendor records organized during the years when we were too small to afford a full accounting staff. When our daughter was born and we decided she'd step back, I'd hired an outside firm to handle the books. I trusted them. I trusted the quarterly summaries. And I trusted my partner the way you trust a man who's shaken your hand over a deal 100 times and never given you cause to doubt him. What my wife discovered, 4 months before she died, was that she had never completely stopped paying attention. She had been going through old filing boxes in my home office, looking for a specific insurance document from 11 years back, the kind of paper trail task she'd always handled better than me, when she opened a box that wasn't labeled the way she expected. Inside were printed company records she recognized as internal routing documents, the kind that showed payment authorizations and vendor disbursements. She'd processed documents like these for years, and the numbers on the ones she was holding did not match what she remembered seeing in our quarterly summaries from the same period. She didn't say anything to me that evening. She went back to the box the following week, when I was out. Then again the week after. She photographed 47 pages with her phone over the course of 6 weeks, building a picture she could take to someone who could read it properly before she brought it to me. She didn't want me making a move based on incomplete information. She knew how much I trusted my partner, and she knew that what she'd found would crack something she wasn't sure could be put back together. What she had found, as best as she could piece together, was this. For at least 5 years, our company had been paying a series of maintenance and fuel vendors that did not exist in any meaningful sense. Shell companies, most of them registered in other states, receiving wire transfers for services that were never rendered or were grossly inflated beyond what any real vendor would charge. The money leaving those accounts went somewhere outside our company's books. And the name appearing on the internal authorization forms for those payments, not my partner's signature, but the name in the approval line, was my son-in-law's. He had come to work for us 3 years before this. He managed the fleet maintenance department. My daughter had married him 8 years earlier. They had 2 children and a house 20 minutes from mine. I had given him that position because he'd asked for a chance, and because I believed in giving the people I loved a place to build something. He'd been good at the job, or so the reports told me. What I hadn't been watching closely enough was what those reports actually said. My wife ended the letter the way she started it. She wrote that she had copied everything onto a small drive, tucked inside the same envelope. She'd been planning to take it to Jerome and to a forensic accountant she'd already researched before she came to me. She wanted it clean and verified. She wanted me protected before I knew. 4 months later, she was gone, and the letter sat in Lorna Holt's office while 6 months passed, and I watered the garden and found things to fix around the house and told myself I'd go in soon. I drove home with the envelope on the passenger seat. I didn't open it again until the following morning. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and read it a second time, then a third. Then I found the small drive at the bottom of the envelope, in a little plastic sleeve my wife had labeled in her handwriting with a single word, evidence. I called Jerome that afternoon and drove to his office the next morning. I put the letter in the drive on his desk without saying anything. He read slowly. He plugged in the drive and went through everything my wife had photographed. He didn't speak while he was reading. When he finished, he leaned back and looked at me the way men look at each other when neither of them wants to be the first to say the thing that has to be said. He said he knew a forensic accountant in Louisville named Eloise Grady who had worked on 2 federal fraud cases in the past 4 years. He said we needed to move carefully. He said I should not call my partner, should not go near the company, should not change anything in my behavior that might signal that something had shifted. He said we were going to do this right. And then, because I needed him to, he held the question I hadn't put into words, the question about why my partner had tried to get that letter 12 days ago before I even arrived. The question about whether a man who knew he was about to be exposed had reason to want my wife's investigation buried before anyone could find it. Jerome didn't answer it. He said it wasn't his territory, but he didn't dismiss it either. He held it in the air between us the way serious men hold serious possibilities. I drove home and fed the dog and sat on the back porch until the light went. Eloise Grady came down from Louisville on a Thursday. She was methodical the way people in her profession learn to be. No wasted words, no editorializing, just the work. She spent the better part of a full day with the photographs my wife had taken, her own laptop and a yellow legal pad. At the end of the day, she told me 3 things. First, the scheme had been running for between 5 and 7 years, using inflated vendor invoices and payments to entities that existed only as registered business names with no employees, no physical address, and no actual service capacity. Her preliminary figure was somewhere between $820,000 and $940,000 diverted over that period. Second, The payment routing structure had been built by my partner. That was clear from the architecture of the accounts. But the names on the individual payment approvals were largely my son-in-law's. He had authorized disbursements to 3 of the shell vendors repeatedly over a 2-year window. Third, she could not determine from the documents alone whether my son-in-law had understood what he was approving or had been given a cover story. The paper wouldn't answer that. I drove home and thought about my daughter's husband for a long time. He was 40 years old. He'd grown up in Harlan County, had a hard few years in his 20s before he found his footing, had been working steadily since. My daughter had chosen him, and my wife had liked him, genuinely, not politely. He was good with their kids in the unself-conscious way that some fathers are, the kind who get down on the floor without thinking about it. I'd always believed he was trying. I'd always believed that what he wanted more than anything was to not go back to the version of himself he'd been before my daughter found him. I thought about what it might take to pull a man like that into something like this, what you'd have to hold over him, what shape that threat would need to take. I called Jerome and told him to move forward with everything. Eloise needed access to the company's actual financial systems to complete her analysis. Jerome handled it carefully, filing a routine audit request through the estate proceedings. My ownership stake in Bluegrass Cold Hall was part of the estate, which gave us a procedural avenue that didn't tip our hand. My partner raised no objection to the audit. He had no reason to think it was anything other than standard paperwork. Eloise spent 3 weeks in the company records. The number she came back with was $897,000, spread across 11 shell vendors over 6 years, touching 16 separate contracts. 8 of those vendors had already been dissolved. One was still technically active, registered under a name connected to my partner's family, someone who Eloise believed likely had no idea their information had been used. My son-in-law's documented approvals covered a 2-year window, 43 specific payment releases. Jerome said the question of what he'd understood versus what he'd been told would matter later, but not right now. Jerome filed with the FBI field office in Louisville on a Monday morning. He'd been in contact with an agent there, a man I'll call Agent Vargas, who had reviewed Eloise's summary and confirmed they were interested. The bureau moved 6 weeks later, on a Friday morning. Before that Friday, I drove to my son-in-law's house. I want to explain why, because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't to give him a way out. What was already moving by then was moving on its own. Jerome had handled it. The federal people had what they needed. Nothing I did in those final days would change the shape of what was coming, but I needed to look at him. The same way I'd needed to hear my daughter's voice on the phone before I told her any of it. Just to brace myself against something real before the world reorganized itself again. My daughter wasn't home. He opened the door, and I could see immediately by the set of his shoulders that part of him had been expecting this for a long time. There's a thing that happens to people who are living on borrowed time. Some part of them is always braced for the knock. We sat at his kitchen table. I put a folder on the surface between us and didn't speak for a while. He didn't try to explain himself immediately. That surprised me. The man I thought I knew would have filled the silence with words the moment it got uncomfortable. He didn't. He sat with it. I told him what I knew. I told him about my wife's letter, about Eloise, about Jerome, about what had been filed. I told him I wasn't there to negotiate or threaten or offer him anything. I told him I needed to understand one thing before everything else happened. Had he known from the beginning what he was actually approving? He looked at the table, then he looked at me. He said no. He said my partner had brought him in gradually, framing the first few payments as a tax structuring arrangement for a legitimate subcontracting relationship that operated outside the standard billing system. He said it had felt unusual, but that my partner was the senior man, and he'd deferred because he didn't understand the business well enough yet to know the difference between unusual and fraudulent. By the time he started to understand that those two things were the same situation, 6 months had passed and his name was on documents that couldn't be explained away. He said my partner had been very clear about what would happen if he tried to stop. There was something in his past, something from his years in Harlan County before my daughter, that my partner had found out about and had made certain he understood would surface if he made trouble. He'd spent 2 years trying to find a way out that didn't destroy his marriage and his children's lives. He hadn't found one. He said he hadn't known my wife had been investigating. When I told him what she'd done, that she'd quietly gathered evidence for weeks, alone, and put it somewhere safe for me to find. He looked down at the table and went still for a moment. When he looked back up, there were tears he wasn't trying to hide. I believed him, not because it was easier, and not because he was married to my daughter. I believed him because in 8 years I had never seen him perform an emotion he didn't feel. And because the look on his face when I said my wife's name was the same look I'd been carrying for 6 months. The look of someone who had loved a person and only understood, too late and all at once, what that person had been quietly doing on their behalf. I told him what was coming. I told him he needed a good attorney and that he needed to cooperate with everything that followed. I told him my daughter needed to hear this from him, not from a federal agent. Then I told him I loved my daughter and I went home. The FBI moved on my partner at 8 in the morning on a Friday. He was at the company yard when they arrived. Jerome called me before 9 to confirm it was done. I won't tell you it felt the way those moments are supposed to feel in the version of the story where justice arrives like a clean verdict. What I felt was tired in a way that rest doesn't reach, and underneath the tired, something that might have been relief. The quiet kind, not the dramatic kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. My son-in-law cooperated fully from the moment his attorney advised him to. He provided documentation, answered every question, helped trace the full architecture of what my partner had built. His attorney negotiated a resolution, a substantial financial penalty, 2 years of supervised probation, permanent disqualification from holding certain financial authority roles. He did not serve prison time. I know some people who hear this story will have opinions about that. I've made my own peace with it for reasons that are mine, and I don't need to defend them. He and my daughter are still together. It wasn't easy and it isn't finished, but they're working at it the way real things require working at. Slowly, with more effort than anyone sees from the outside. She came down to stay with me for 2 weeks when everything broke. She cleaned out the last of her mother's things that I hadn't been able to touch. She made dinner and sat with me in the evenings and didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed. She has always known the difference between the problems that need solving and the ones that just need someone present. She got that from her mother. Jerome formally requested that the Kentucky State Police review the circumstances of my wife's cardiac event in light of what we'd uncovered. She'd had a known cardiac history, yes, but her last checkup had been clean. What I know is that she had called my partner 3 weeks before she died, asking questions about certain company records, telling him she was reviewing paperwork for her estate planning. He'd known she was looking. The investigation into her death is ongoing. The detective who reviewed her original case said there were elements he considered worth a closer examination. Whether that examination ever produces a definitive answer, I don't know. I've had to learn to live inside that uncertainty. Some days I manage it better than others. Bluegrass Cold Hall still exists. I dissolved the partnership through the legal proceedings and restructured what remained under my ownership alone. My partner's assets were subject to recovery orders, and while the full amount will likely never come back in totality, enough was recovered to matter. I brought in a manager I'd known for 15 years and scaled back. Fewer routes, clients I knew personally, the kind of work I'd done before the company got complicated. Smaller, quieter. That suits me now. There is something I want to say about what my partner understood when he built this scheme, because I've thought about it more than anything else in the months since. I was 67 years old. I had stepped back from daily operations. I'd handed the financial monitoring to an outside firm and trusted the quarterly numbers they gave me, because the contracts were solid and the company was running and I had no visible reason to look harder. My partner knew all of that. I think part of what made his calculation feel safe to him was the belief that I had become the kind of older partner who doesn't watch anymore, the one who built something and then let the monitoring slide because the sliding felt like what you'd earned after decades of not sliding. He was right about the sliding. He was wrong about what it would cost him. What he hadn't counted on was that my wife had never stopped watching. She had stepped back from the company 11 years earlier, but the part of her that cared about what we'd built together had not stepped back at all. She'd found something she didn't expect in an unlabeled filing box in my home office. And she had done what she always did with a problem, worked it quietly, carefully, without alarm, until she had something solid enough to hand to someone who could use it. She didn't get to hand it to anyone. She ran out of time. But she put it somewhere I would eventually find it. She wrote me a letter. She signed it the way she signed everything, with her full name in cursive and underneath that, in the same ink. All my love, always. I keep the letter in my desk, not locked. I've read it more times than I can count. I've memorized the places where the pen pressed a little harder into the page because she was leaning into what she was saying, and the places where the loops in her letters got slightly wider the way they always did when she was writing fast, because she had more to say than she had space for. She spent the last months of her life trying to protect something we had built over 40 years together. She didn't tell me. She didn't alarm me. She simply did the work, the way she'd done every hard thing we ever faced, quietly, completely, without needing any acknowledgement for it. I ask different questions now. About the books, the contracts, the people I choose to trust and why I trust them. I don't assume that familiarity is the same thing as reliability. I don't let the comfort of a business that appears to be running make me believe it doesn't need watching. It's not a lesson I would have chosen for myself. But she found a way to teach it to me even after she was gone, and I intend to carry it the rest of the way.